You know, it's easy not to like the runaway royals, Harry and Meghan, the complaining, the playing the victim, the race politics, the running away from their duties, the massive self-regard, the massive self-publicity, and the fortune they're now making in Hollywood. We're still crying, oh, poor us. And there is criticism now of the way they marked Remembrance Day yesterday, hiring a photographer to snap them on their own, laying a wreath for fallen soldiers out at a cemetery in Los Angeles. Just them, their photographer, maybe a stylist, and then all distributed by their PR people. Joining me is Daisy Cousens, a YouTube star with her own video channel. Daisy, how's this played out on social media? As, you know, genuine tribute, or just look at us, look at us?
Well, sort of unfortunately for Meghan Markle and Prince Harry, their little publicity stunt has somewhat been eclipsed by, of course, the trending US election. So if they were trying to, you know, have a kind of, you know, publicity stunt, get a bit of publicity, this was the wrong time to do it. But for those who did comment, Twitter is, as we need to remember, a lefty safe space. So the majority of the commentary I saw was actually in favour of Meghan Markle and dismissing, as usual, any criticism of her as racism. It's racist to say that they did anything wrong by staging this photo up. But of course, you know, of the faithful that did comment negatively, of course, Piers Morgan, who's a long-time critic of Meghan and Harry, had a bit to say about that. They said it was very inappropriate to use
surely
it as a photo
you jest. Surely,
no, very
surely you jest.
But,
no, well, it's interesting. It was interesting because one thing that made me suspicious, Daisy, was that, all right, you know, he wanted, and as a former soldier, he wanted to pay his respects. So I gather that and I honour that. Why you had to make it a publicity event, that's another matter. Why was that leaked at the same, released at the same time that it was leaked the story that the royal family, those cruel people, had refused to lay a wreath on his behalf at their ceremony over in London?
Oh, well, yes, exactly. I think it was clearly a bit of an up yours to England that they decided to stage this so beautifully with just the two of them in the ceremony and to come out at exactly the same time. But because, of course, Harry's request to lay a wreath, to have a wreath laid on his behalf by the royal family was denied because of the fact that he elected, remember, to end his royal duties and to end his military service. He has only himself to blame for that. But like I said, it generally got eclipsed by the election coverage. So sorry, Meghan and Harry, didn't quite work for you.
Now, there was, look, you may say it's the same reason, or you might say that maybe there's a lot in the media who do not want to acknowledge what's actually going on in France with these beheadings, etc., etc. There was a story in a few media outlets today that I thought was significant, yet given very little coverage more widely. French police have been investigating the beheading last month of a teacher who was murdered for showing his students cartoons of the Muslim prophet Muhammad. That's one thing. But the French Interior Ministry now says something quite ominous, that police are now sending 4 students aged 10 for some sort of re-education program or something, after they justified the teacher's assassination, saying it was forbidden to offend their prophet. They even said that they would kill their teacher if he or she caricatured the prophet. No interest in social media in this very dangerous cultural fault line, Daisy?
No, absolutely none. And the thing is, there wouldn't have been any interest in it even if the US election hasn't been going on at the moment because, you know, as I mentioned, Twitter is a lefty safe space. And of course, any criticism of Islam in any capacity is considered Islamophobic. Whereas in this case, of course, it's not at all. It's about the fate of 4 little children who've obviously been subject to some atrocious dogma in their homes, perhaps, or their education that needs to be absolutely rooted out and squashed. What is so dangerous here, Andrew, is that children, because they are so malleable and so innocent, they can be turned into weapons of war by the right extremists. Of course, you think of child soldiers in Africa, you go back, you've got Hitler Youth, you've got ISIS itself in Syria, which was training child militants to fight for them and potentially be suicide bombers. It is so dangerous and so sad because the children are the victims in this. So I'm extremely pleased that the French police seem to be taking this extremely extremely seriously and re-educating these kids, because the worry is that if they found 4 of them, there are most likely more little children out there who feel the same way. So they need to crack down on this right now for the children's sake as well as everyone else's.
Yeah, well, I'd like to know what was being done about their parents. Now, Daisy, something that without a shadow of a doubt, has been hot on social media, the US election. Twitter, for one, has been working overtime to censor tweets by Donald Trump claiming voter fraud. Warnings on so many, you've got to click through to see them, disproves. Look at that, it's just one after the other. And then many of the major TV networks stopped broadcasting a press conference by the president, who's still the president. The black squares represent those stations that cut him off as soon as he started to claim he was robbed, that there was voter fraud out there. Now, I don't agree with him that the fraud is of a kind that, so significant to have flipped the election. But I find it so ominous, this censorship, that major TV networks would not even let the president make his case. What do you make of all this?
Well, I'm sure you remember a couple of weeks ago I said that the censorship of content about the Hunter Biden laptop scandal was the worst censorship I'd ever seen on Twitter and in the media. Well, this is worse. This is infinitely worse. I have never seen anything like this, Andrew. Any kind of tweet, not just from Donald Trump, but from anyone that mentions the possibility that there's even a slight irregularity in the election result is being dismissed and censored. And as you say, you have to click through a dozen warnings to actually get there. And this is despite the fact that Twitter allowed any mention of Russian collusion, which is a far less believable theory than a little bit of domestic interference, to trend all over the place. And what irritates me, Andrew, is I know Donald Trump is talking very specifically about fraud, but look, think about it. He has to fire up the base. And the best way to keep them engaged and interested and fighting hard, of course, is to talk about fraud. But there are actually some very legitimate legal challenges, which are totally non-controversial. There's often litigation after a US election, recounts, etc., that could potentially have an effect on the results. And what's irritating me is that there is simply not enough discussion of this in the media, who have decided that they have the constitutional power to call the election for Joe Biden. That is completely false. The media has no power at all to call the election. Joe Biden is not the president-elect just because CNN says so, when the votes have not been verified, the count hasn't finished, and legal action is only just starting to be brought. One that is of particular note is the case of, say, poll watchers in Wisconsin and Pennsylvania who were not permitted. There have been multiple reports. They were prevented from actually watching and verifying the count, often quite aggressively, which would possibly mean the Republicans will argue that those votes that were counted in that manner were counted illegally and should therefore be disqualified. The second one that could be particularly interesting, this I think is the strongest case they have, is again in Pennsylvania, where the Republicans have brought to the Supreme Court of the United States, the biggest court in the land, that the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania unconstitutionally ruled that ballots could be received up to 3 days after the election in Pennsylvania, when the legislature had ruled earlier in the year in Pennsylvania that that was not the case. They had to be received by Election Day. The Supreme Court of the United States saw this matter before the election, indicated they were concerned that this ruling was constitutional, and that they will review it again after the election. Given the makeup of the court, which is of course a 6-3 conservative majority, many of them constitutional originalists, it is highly likely, Andrew, that they will in fact rule in favor of the Republicans, which would mean that any ballot received after the election day, which have been instructed to be kept separate, will be struck off. If that's the case, that most likely means that the state of Pennsylvania and all of its 20 electoral college votes will go to Donald Trump. Add to that the fact that the count in Arizona has not finished, and the Republicans are pretty confident, it seems, still that they will eventually win Arizona, since the gap is narrowing. That takes away 31 electoral college votes from Joe Biden, which pulls him under the 270 minimum that he needs, and that throws the whole thing wide open again. Then it's down to the state of Georgia and their recount. So shame on the media for declaring that, according to them, Joe Biden is now suddenly the president of the United States, and shame on Kamala Harris and Joe Biden for using this as their cue to make their so-called victory speeches when nothing is verified. The count hasn't even finished, and we have yet to see what the courts decide.
Well, that was extremely well put, Daisy. I mean, I'm not so sure that there are enough votes in Pennsylvania, even if the court ruling goes that way, but we don't know. You make some very good points. I've had my say, but I won't engage further. I'm glad that you had yours. Daisy Cousens, thank you so much indeed for your time.
Thank you so much, Andrew.